Another high-profile killing of an African-American man at the hands of a police officer using what can really only be described as shocking and excessive force. George Floyd's death has captured the attention of America and the world. Angry demonstrators taking to the streets in the name of racial justice. Well, tonight we bring you an in-depth look at Unrest in America special report. Our guests tonight are Fred Brewington, a civil rights attorney, and Errol Toulon Jr., the Suffolk County Sheriff. Gentlemen, thank you very much for having this. What is an extremely important and too often an uncomfortable conversation. Thank you so much for your time. Fred, let me start with you. This isn't the first time that we have seen a death at the hands of police caught on video. I mean, we could list names all night. But this seems to have caught not just America's attentions, but we're having protests in Stockholm, in London, in France. They're burning American flags. The Pope has come out and denounced this. What makes this different, or is this different?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we have is that obviously we have such a long period of time when an officer has his knee on the foot of this unfortunate gentleman, Mr. Floyd, and as a result, we see the desensitization that happens with police officers like this, who simply just didn't care that he had a human being who was crying for help. I mean, the man called out for his mother, and his mother isn't even around. So I think one of the things that we have is that make this a little different. Is that the longevity of the suffering that we see on the video makes it even more a human element that people have to deal with.
Sheriff Toulon, I mean that's a great point. It's the length. I mean, what was it? 8 minutes 46 seconds kneeling on this man's neck and him gasping for air the whole time. But we went through the Rodney King beatings, also caught on camera. We've had unrest in America. We've gone through a lot of riots and unrest. How do we have the discussion about race in America?
First, thanks for having me on, Stone. One of the most important things that we have to do is really speak to our community, and not just our community leaders. As you see in these protests, there are people of all races, all ages, people we would normally not see 30 or 40 years ago protesting. And so we owe it to our youth, we owe it to our communities to really engage in a conversation that's going to start to change the culture and their perception. This incident has set back community and police relations hundreds of years because of the amount of time, because of 3 other officers that stood by and let it happen as we saw this man in distress.
How do you relate to law enforcement? I mean, you're a law enforcement officer, but you're also an African-American man who grew up in this country, who understands and has felt this the racism in the systemic society. How do you deal with that within a police department that says we're not racists?
Really, it's by talking to our staff, identifying issues very early on. The police officer in question who committed this murder had 18 complaints against him. So clearly someone of the supervisory staff should have noticed that there was an issue with this person's conduct, either with his absenteeism, there was a problem. And we have to meet these problems very quickly with our staff. There can be, personal reasons that are going on, mental health issues. Our staff are human too. But as supervisors and as a leader of an organization, we have to try to identify them, hopefully get them the help so they can recover. And if not, then we have to terminate them. We see many times a person that comes on in their early 20s are not the same officer in their early 30s. And so when that change starts to occur, we really need to address it as supervisory staff.
So Fred, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's a very interesting and enlightened position, and I just say that with regard to Errol, that's something that more law enforcement people need to realize, that when a police officer or even a corrections officer comes on the force, they're required to take an examination to evaluate their mental stability. After you're on the job for 3 years, minimally, this job has to have an effect on you. There's no question about it. And we need to realize that police do have a difficult job, but that does not give them license to act in the way that we saw and what we see regularly with regard to the abuse that they subject citizens to. So my suggestion clearly is that after 3 years, and I think this is a society change that can take place, that after 3 years, every police officer has to go through a psychological evaluation every 3 years. By doing so, we ensure their safety, but ensure the fact that they are still the same person or maybe matured in their personage so that they can deal with the public. There is no question. This is, again, a difficult job, but the change that happens to them requires that we be more vigilant in terms of making sure that they are prepared and have the psyche to be able to handle the job.
Okay, I want to bring this soundbite in. Earlier today we caught up with the Nassau County Police Commissioner, Pat Ryder. There have been, the last 2 days, there have been about 15 demonstrations. There were 4 today. We asked the commissioner about this. This is what he had to say. Fred, I want to ask you a question about this on the other side.
We are on the side of peace. We don't go looking for fights in law enforcement, but when the fight comes to us, we have to do what we have to do. So the acts of what happened in Minneapolis, nobody stands by that officer. You can't, right? We don't train that way. We don't do police. And it gives all the cops a bad name. We got great cops here in Nassau County. They're well-trained, well-disciplined, and they treat the public with respect. And we want that same respect to be treated back to our officers. And we've been seeing it so far in all of our protests.
I want to get both of your reactions to that. Fred, first you. Is that strong enough coming from the Nassau County Police Commissioner?
Absolutely not. And first of all, I mean, the fact that he said this officer and with the actions of this officer, there were other officers that stood by and did nothing to stop the murder of a human being in front of them. There were individuals that said nothing, did nothing, and took no action. In fact, they threatened the individuals that were pleading with the officer to stop the killing of Mr. Floyd. So the statement that nobody stands behind this officer is not strong enough. And clearly, there's an indication here that somehow, and the comment that we have to do what we have to do if indeed they're pushed to it, is not an answer. That's the real societal ill that happens in policing, thinking that they can then flip a switch and turn into a military response to something that is societal and has a greater impact, not just what they do at that particular moment, but for long term. And in this situation, the long term for Mr. Floyd is that he's not here to even speak for himself.
And Sheriff Toulon, get your reaction to that. Was that strong enough, and how would you have handled that?
You know, so I've spoken to the men and women in the sheriff's office, and we're addressing any issue with any staff member that we may see. And with the meeting of force, it's the meeting of force with the force that the resistance that the officer is getting. So, you know, we're not going to use excessive force, unnecessary force. You know, we're going to try and use de-escalation methods. And it's very incumbent upon the person that's leading the organization to set that tone that some things, you know, any type of criminality, excessive force is not going to be accepted. So if we have someone that's non-compliant, we're going to use the minimum amount of force to make sure that they are compliant. There's no excessive or unnecessary force, and it has to start with the head of the agency.
Okay, gentlemen, great discussion. We're going to continue this discussion on the other side of the break. More discussion on unrest in America right after this. Stay with us. All right, let's continue our discussion of unrest in America. Let's bring back in our guests, Fred Brewington, civil rights attorney, and Errol Toulon, Jr., the Suffolk County Sheriff. Again, thank you, gentlemen, for your time. Sheriff Toulon, let me ask you this. This is an uncomfortable question, but is our system of justice, is there systemic racism in our system of justice and in our policing?
You know, when you look at the disparate amount of African-American and Latino inmates in our jails, you know, you can truly say there's some sort of disparate treatment, whether it's upon arrest, whether it's through the judicial system and courts, because we see them as those that work in jails or correctional institutions see the amount of inmates that are coming through. We don't see the arrests where there may be ACODs or some sort of, a bail's paid at the court. And so clearly there is an issue. How we get to the root causes of those issues, education, healthcare, employment, are things that all lead to that point where there's some sort of criminal behavior or they're winding up in a correctional setting.
So, Fred, let me ask you this. Is it going to solve anything if these officers are convicted? I mean, they've now been charged, but is it going to solve anything? I mean, it's been 244 years that we've been dealing with this.
Well, it's not 244 years. You got to go back to before the Mayflower, but yeah. I won't take us there. What you're asking is not a simple question. First of all, there is a quantum of justice that must take place with regard to the murder of George Floyd. But there's a much more in-depth question, and I think the sheriff hit it right on the head. There are so many problems that we have as a society that we have failed to address overall. There are societal ills that deal with housing, that deal with education, that deal with food insecurity, that deal with employment, that we even saw them crop up during Corona-19 in terms of the clear disparate numbers of persons of color, African American and Hispanic, that died as a result of underlying health issues and the failure of the health system to address that. And that's a public issue. That's not just a Black issue or a Latino issue. That's a community issue that we failed to address. We've got some societal ills, and our leaders, from the local all the way up to the White House, have to address these issues head on. America has not had the conversation and refuses to have the real conversation that needs to take place. We know we brought people to this country in the bottom of boats as unwelcome immigrants. And as a result of that, we then called them less than human by not my words, but the words of the Supreme Court of the United States. Justice Taney said that in the Dred Scott.
Yeah.
So the reality is that we have failed as in the great experiment that we call America to address the greatest ills, which is that all persons should be considered created equal. But in this situation, we have failed miserably. Dr. King said we were given a check that has come up with insufficient funds. And as a result of that, we are in a devastating set of circumstances on the rear end of a pandemic.
Yeah, and gentlemen, I'm going to have to make that the last word. Thank you so much for an uncomfortable conversation. Hopefully we at least broached the subject. I know this is too big for the time we have right now. That is all the time we have. Thank you very much, Fred Brewington and Sheriff Toulon Jr. for taking the time and speaking with us tonight. You've been watching Unrest in America, a special report. I'm Stone Grissom.